Welcome to the Woodward Chronicles. This series is dedicated to honoring the legacy of Mr. Ronald Woodward, who served as Wabash County historian from 1981 to 2025 and was awarded the title of Wabash County Historian Emeritus by the Indiana Historical Society. Mr. Woodward shares Wabash County's recorded history in his own words. Each episode invites us to listen, learn, and reflect on the rich stories from the past. Settle in. We're glad you're here.
Aviation in Wabash County.
Okay.
We'll be glad to talk about that. A lot of us don't quite know when aviation became an interest in Wabash County, but it goes way back in our history. In fact, out at the Poor Farm Cemetery out on Manchester Avenue, there is, sitting up on the hill in the old Poor Farm Cemetery, long abandoned and seldom taken care of, there is a grave unmarked of a man who from 1861 to about 1865 flew in a balloon. Very few people know about Richard Creasy. In fact, I can't find very much information on him at all, but I do know this about him. He joined the Balloon Corps during the Civil War. He served with General Thomas and General Sherman, with Sherman on his march to the sea. In the Library of Congress, there are 3 photographs that he took of the battle at Chattanooga. And that's about truly all we know. But, well, we do know a little bit more. With those generals, he served as a balloonist. He would go up in a hot air balloon over the battlefield and take pictures and draw sketches of troop movements and forward them back down to General Thomas or General Sherman as to what was going on. At that time, the Balloon Corps was not attached to the government in any way whatsoever. He was a private citizen who joined up, went up in a balloon, took pictures, and drew maps.
So he owned his own balloon and just thought, I'd like to serve my country, so I'm going to use my own balloon and float over the enemy?
He didn't use his own balloon.
Okay.
He worked for another man by the name of Lowe, and Lowe was able to get a grant from the government to build some balloons, and they followed whatever general would allow them to go, and Thomas and Sherman were both ones who would let him go. With Sherman, he would have advanced engineers send him notes back as to what to expect. Advanced troops would let them know where the trains were going, where boats were, where towns were, where roads were, what to expect. And then he would prepare that in a map form. And sometimes he would go up over the battlefield itself and draw those kind of maps and relay them back down. So a very interesting character that we know very little about. He died when he was 60 years old. He could not get into Soldiers and Sailors home because he wasn't a veteran. He was a volunteer so he wasn't in the military as such. So they wouldn't let him into the home for military veterans down in Marion or over at Lafayette. So he was able to get into the Poor Farm, and they took care of him until he died at the age of 60 years of age. The only other thing we know about him is that he married a woman from Huntington County, but he ended up here. And again, there's no marker on his gravestone. It's one of those stories that's been forgotten in our past history as to accomplishments. And that's early, 1765. We had a gentleman from this county involved in flying. And it's amazing. But in 1890, people began to be more interested in balloon flight than ever before. Creasy's history had been forgotten about. Once in a while, some itinerant balloonman would come through Wabash during county fair time or just any time and set up a balloon and fly. We don't have any records of those people, but in the 1890s, we begin to have records. People began to be more aware that man can fly. Man can get up there in the air and go places, a dream that he'd had ever since the 1600s when the Montgolfiers in France had begun creating balloons. But they were mainly used before the 1890s for military purposes. But in the 1890s, became entertainment. And as early as 1890, we had itinerant balloonists coming to Wabash County. In 1890, at North Manchester, a man set up a balloon and got it up in the air. And on board, he had a whole host of different animals, rabbits, guinea pigs, chickens, ducks, dogs, and cats. And he had made parachutes for them. And he went up about 250 feet into the air, and then he would toss those animals out for the audience to watch them fly down to the earth. He was able to get that hot air balloon to move from the northwest side of North Manchester all the way to the south side, maybe about 1.5 miles, 2 miles. He was able to travel through the air the whole time, dropping these animals out, and the audience would follow along and pick up the creatures as they were tossed out. When he was stationary, he then would take people up and let them float up to 200 or so feet and look out over the surrounding area. We don't have his name. We just know that happened. And he wasn't the only one. They started having hot air balloons at county fairs. Wabash had one at the county fair. They even had one at Rowan. And at Rowan, kind of for their booster days was before they had the festival they have now of the Covered Bridge Festival. And the fella was going to try and make money. He would charge you 10 cents, and you could stand in the balloon and float up and look around town and come back down. Well, he hired some young boys to hold the ropes while he was getting everything ready. And one of the boys became anxious and dropped the rope, and it caught fire. And the fire spread to the balloon, and poof, there went the man's profits for the day. And his hope for riches and people's hopes of flying up just shattered. Then there was a man in Wabash, and I'm pretty sure he was a teacher at the high school. His name was Professor Charles McFall. And he was very interested in hot air balloons. He would create his own hot air balloon, and he would try and fly out of the Wabash City Park. He would announce that he was going to have a flight and that for so much you could go up and look around downtown. And he was going to try and see how far he could go in his balloon. Well, the first balloon that he tried to get up split in half, so it never went anywhere. The second balloon split in half, never went anywhere. The third balloon, he got up in the air and was able to travel from the city park there on West Hill Street all the way down to what we call Container. He was able to fly that far before it came down. His problem was keeping the air hot enough to keep it high in the air. In Wabash, we've still got and still have an interest in hot air balloons, believe it or not. Every once in a while, a Goodyear blimp out of Akron will fly overhead, and people will go out and look at it. Yeah. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. We want to look at those kind of dirigibles, hot air balloons. In 1986, a class of students at Wabash Middle School spent part of their learning experience creating a hot air balloon out of crepe paper. They took crepe paper and glued it into sheets and made a huge ball for the hot air balloon. and it was, I would say maybe 6 feet across. It was a pretty good size. All the students put all their effort into it, and they created the balloon bag, and then they created a basket underneath of it. In order to get it to go up in the air, they had their science teacher loan them a portable butane lighter, and they used that to create the heat to fill up the balloon and have it float up. In the basket, they also created enough room and a specially seated compartment that they put a mouse in, and they sent the mouse up in the balloon. Now, it only got to about maybe 40 feet in the air, and it traveled only about 10 or 15 feet. There wasn't enough heat or a source of heat to keep it going. If they would have used some other source of heat rather than butane, it may have stayed up longer. But it went almost 40 feet into the air and traveled, maybe half a block before it came down, collapsing and falling down. The mouse was still alive. They had taken a box and filled it with cotton so that when they could put him inside it, he would be protected when he fell to the earth. So still an interest in that kind of aviation. But even though hot air balloons were an attraction, there was something else coming along, and that was sponsored by two brothers, the Wright brothers, who had come up with an idea in their bicycle shop of how to create a heavier than air machine that could actually fly. And in 1909, they were able to do that and succeeded in their experiences, and the world just opened up. In Wabash, in 1909, 10, 11, if an airplane flew overhead, people left their shops, people left their businesses. They went out and watched it fly through the air. It was amazing that man could actually do this. And from then on, we've had an active love and support for airplanes in Wabash County. And that support has taken many different forms and many different shapes. But in our earliest history, in 1910, we have our real first experience with an airplane. There was an airplane created called the Vin Fizz Flyer. It's on exhibit in the Smithsonian Institute. Even to this day, you can go see the Vin Fizz. The Vin Fizz was a grape drink that was very popular in 1910, like grape soda. And they sponsored the first transcontinental air flight in the United States. It left from New York and went to Pasadena, California in 1910. It came through Wabash County.
Wow.
It was the first real flight transcontinentally in the history of the United States, and we played a part in it. It was able to follow railroad tracks from New York westward, got to Detroit, and it followed the railroad tracks from the Detroit area down to Huntington. At Huntington, it made a stop. It made 19 stops in total. But at Huntington, when it took off, because of the crowd, it hit a fence and tore apart. The man who was flying the plane rebuilt it, repaired it, and took off the next day. He followed the Erie Railroad from Huntington to New Madison. Now, we call New Madison Serbia. He flew over Serbia, went on to Laketon, and then out at New Harrisburg, which we now call Disco, and then on to Chicago, and then completed his flight. In 1986, a gentleman recreated that flight. However, when he got to Serbia, the weather was so bad that he had to land.
Windy, rain, snow?
Rain.
Okay.
And he landed at the Serbia airport. We had an airport at Serbia, which was built, about 1950 and lasted until about 1986, 7, somewhere in that area. And it was just a small airport, a grass airport, but it supported quite a few airplanes and had a hangar. And the hangar is still there. When you go through Serbia on, I believe it's 500, but I could be wrong, on County Road 500, on the north end of Serbia, you can still make out the hangar, which held about 3 airplanes. And the house that sits there now was the office at the time. And the runway was about 1,000 feet. And the runway was there long after it closed, but today it's a cornfield, so you can't make it out. But there was an airfield there. And the man who set that up, well, in the 1940s, after World War II, a lot of men returning had been involved with the Army Air Corps, which we now call the Air Force. And they were so enthralled with flying that they brought that passion and love back with them. And that was one of the airports that they set up. Another airport that they set up was at Lincolnville, to the south of Lincolnville. If you take the major intersection there at Lincolnville, I think 400 south, but I'm not sure of the north-south road, but 400 south to the major intersection, you turn right. It was about a mile from that intersection where the restaurant used to sit. But it was mainly for crop dusting and that kind of thing. Those 2 airports were started mainly by veterans from the war. They were just minor airports. However, the major airport would be in Wabash. And in Wabash, we had 3 sites for our airport. Now, after the VinFizz flew through Wabash County, more interest started to develop. In 1911, you had another airplane fly over. It was on Thanksgiving Day. It was a military plane that was flying from Detroit to St. Louis, I believe, flying military parts, and they hit a rainstorm. So they landed south of Rowan. The whole town turned out to gather around the field where the clearest field they could find, they landed in. And they landed there. The town turned out. One family took them in tow. The men in the crowd hooked a rope to the airplane and pulled it into a barn so that it would be protected from the environment, from the rain. They took the men into the house and gave them Thanksgiving. They were given a tour of Rowan, and they were invited into other families for other meals. And then the next day at breakfast time, several hundred showed up to escort them back to the barn, get the plane out, and take off. It was a big, big occasion. Well, about 1912, we had another incident. Another plane came down, and this one was, again, it was a storm, and it was getting late, and it landed on Albert Street, out by where 24, it intersects 24. It just came right down in Albert Street. The whole town turns out. There are 2 Army officers on board. They wined and dined them and showed them all the great things we had in Wabash at that time and treated them like royalty. The next day, marched them back out there and watched them take off. There were other times where other planes came down as well. They did have an airplane at Boyd Park, the amusement park out at Rich Valley. An airplane did come down there for people to see. It was kind of what we imagine what the Wright brothers plane looked like. But in 1919, we took a big leap forward. People in Wabash had the imagination and the foresight to see that wagons, which had become cars, that there was something out there there was a future in this thing called aviation. And one of our service motor truck company decided that they were going to experiment with creating an airplane. So in 1919, that's exactly what they did. They formed what they called SATCO, Service Air Transport Company. And what they did is they purchased 4 planes like this one. These were World War I planes that the government no longer had a need for or no longer wanted, and they would sell them very cheaply to anybody who'd buy one. Well, they bought 4 of these planes, and what they were going to do is take this biplane that you see, and they were going to put a fuselage to it, a huge body that you could carry things in. And that's exactly what they did. They created their own SATCO airplane. But in the beginning, this is what they used. Now, you have to have an airport. Wabash's very first airport is located on Cass Street at about where Coleraine Avenue is, just north of the cemetery. Right now, there's a Mexican restaurant out there. But at one time, that was the SATCO airport for Service Motor Truck Company. And they went crazy building airplanes. They established not only a school to train people to fly, but they brought flyers to Wabash who would then train other flyers to be here. It only lasted for about a year when they decided that Wabash weather wasn't really great for training. Guess where they went to? Texas. Texas, more flat land, and not only flat, but warmer weather and a warmer climb. So they eventually moved their training school out there. They did build the first enclosed fuselage and used for sending goods around to other plants and to their customers and people who needed parts for their trucks. By 1924, they went out of business, though. It wasn't productive for them. However, before they went out of business, the very first woman to fly in Wabash County was Eloise Wilson, the wife of the mayor. She was the very first woman to take a flight in an airplane out of Wabash. Nothing bad happened to her. She was followed by another gentleman, a man by the name of John Higgins, who was 101 years old at the time he went up, which was about 1919 or 1920. He had served in the British Navy. He had served in the Civil War in the U.S. Navy as well. And in honoring him, they took him up for a flight at 101 years of age. At one time, there was the claim that he was the oldest man to ever have flown, but I'm sure that didn't hold true. For a while, that was the only airport, and eventually they sold the hangar, which became the Wayside Inn, which was an amusement center, which had roller skating, but was really known for its dancing. They were a dance hall for many years.
Right there on Cass Street, where the Satco Airport was. When
Right.
they sold it, their hangar got turned into a dance hall.
Right. And that's where Muy Pueblo is today. Eventually it caught fire, but was rebuilt and was turned into a sale barn, which later on was also torn down and moved over to Central Shoppers Mart there for a number of years. A group of men in Wabash didn't like seeing the airport closed. They thought there was a great value to it. So they organized themselves and built the second airport, which was located where Pizza Hut is today. Between Pizza Hut and Kroger's, that shopping center there, that was the next airport, and it's had a variety of names. It's been called the Reddig Airport, among many. And in fact, that's who we generally associate the airport with. and it would stay in existence from the 1920s up until the 1950s. And it was it ran east and west and was about 1,000-foot long runway made for smaller planes. And there were 4 or 5 businessmen in town who would have their own airplanes that they would fly. The Reddigs took that field over, and they used it. The Reddig store on Canal Street was an industrial supplies store, and they also had another plant over on Miami Street. And the goods from there, they would ship out all over Indiana to whoever needed parts for their factories or machines or what have you. And George Reddig took the lead in that. He trained people how to fly out there, so they had a flying school. It was not a real big establishment. They had a building about the size of this room, which I'm going to assume is about 25 feet by about 20 feet. And that was their office and headquarters, and where they had their radio to talk to pilots who did have a radio. Most of the time they didn't. But that airport was in business for over 30 years. And it was out of that airport that we had our first serious accident. A pilot who had been running the airport before Reddig took off from that field one day with a passenger. And for some reason, something went wrong, and he crash landed over where the vocational center is, in about that area. He crashed there and died. So that was the first death we ever had from an airplane crash. There have been more accidents since, and there have been casualties since as well. But many people have enjoyed flying and still want to fly. At that airport, one of the greatest things they had was the Beechnut Company had an airplane that would fly around the country and advertise their chewing gum, Beechnut chewing gum.
Beechnut had chewing gum?
Yes.
I thought it was just tobacco.
There was also tobacco. Yes, ma'am. But one of those unique chewing gums of the 20s and 30s, which you can still find today, like blackjack, which tasted like licorice. And there was also teaseberry, but I can't remember the flavor of it. And there was another, cloves. I love cloves. It tasted just like cloves, and it just deadened your mouth when you chewed it. But they were 5 cents a pack. But the Beechnut Company flew that airplane in, and it was a monoplane. It only had one wing. It flew over the city and then landed. And for the kids who showed up, they passed out free chewing gum to everybody, got back in the plane, and took off again. Other companies and flyers would fly in, and for a day they would invite the public to come out. And for $2 or $3, you could take a flight up around Wabash and fly around. We also had barnstormers who would come here to town and do trick flying, loop-de-loops and what have you. And we also had parachute jumps as well. The young kids in town, I got to tell you a story about a young man. I won't mention his name.
Because his name was alive. Ronald Woodward.
No, he's still alive. At night when the airport would close down and there wasn't any hangars, the airplanes just out in the open, the young high school boys would sneak over to the airport and get in the airplanes, but they couldn't start them. But what they could do is the airplanes had been tied down and they had chocks to keep the wheels in place. They'd remove those and they would sit in the seat, and a couple of boys would push them around the airport so they would pretend to be flying the airplane. Oh, well, that's how interested they were. But in the late 30s, the young boys of Wabash had model airplane clubs. They would build their own model airplanes. They were mainly gliders. They weren't big enough to provide a motor for them, but mainly gliders, but we had clubs that would make them. And we even had a company in Wabash as late as the 1950s who were making hand gliders in kits that you could buy for as cheap as 29 cents and make them. I used to buy these little kits, and they were made in Wabash out of
so
balsa
not a
wood.
glider that you would put on your back and jump off the reservoir.
No. These are airplane.
Model airplane.
They're balsa, and they vary in size. The most common was a foot in size and wingspan of about a foot, but they got up to as big as that couch over there, maybe 4 or 5 feet in size. These were not small planes. We call them gliders because they use the air currents in gliding. But, the kids were fascinated by those and were intrigued, and they wanted to make their own. And we had a club that would do that, and they would go out to the airport and have competition among themselves as to who could fly the furthest one of these gliders that they had made by hand. And it's just one of those many businesses that we've forgotten about that existed in Wabash for a short time. They just took a sheet of balsa wood, drew the wings, the tail wings, and the body, and they had it outlined so you could cut it out with a sharp knife, and then you could just piece them together and fly them. A lot of fun, tremendous amount of fun that kids sometimes today don't even realize, that that's fun. But then I remember when you flew airplanes made out of paper. It was just a great thrill to make an airplane and be able to see it do a loop-de-loop and fly down the gymnasium in school. The simple things like that sometimes can just turn kids amazing. I'm sure you remember in your childhood maybe taking a box and creating something amazing out of the box. Maybe you had steps in your house and you could slide down the steps on that, or something to hide in, or a secret hideout, or what have you. But anyway, simple things like that. A balsa wood airplane was just great. To go out and sit in an airplane and have someone push you around the airport, that was classy. That was the highlight of one's day or week. Yeah. But the airport, and I must tell you, the shack that was used for the office had a sign painted on it. And the sign was very simple: fly safe. And that was the airport that the pilot flew out of and killed himself. Around town, there were other things related to that airport that most people aren't aware of. For instance, over on Canal and Huntington Street, used to be a dry cleaners, and the building is still there, and it had a flat top, and on the top of it, they painted the word Wabash, Indiana, so pilots flying overhead would know where they were. Mm-hmm. And today, if you think about it, and it's one of those things it's there, you don't realize it. But if you're going down Stitt Street at Falls Cemetery, have you ever noticed at the Stitt and Falls entrance, there are these large words in white, Wabash, so you could see it from the air. Oh. And a lot of pilots, that was how they would navigate, is they would follow the railroad tracks. If you were coming from Marion, you followed the Big Four up to Wabash. Now, how would you know it was Wabash? There'd be a sign on that building that said Wabash, and you could see it from the air. If you missed that, you could see the sign at the airport as well.
Building on Canal and Huntington Street's no longer there.
Oh, it's there.
Is it the one that Paradise Spring, that big brick one?
No. You're too far south, going east. Come back one block. Bulldog Battery is located in the building. They have their office building there at the corner on the northeast corner. And that site had been Hutchins Dry Cleaners before he moved over to Canal and Miami Street, the Martinizing
So that building's still there. Does it still say Wabash?
It's still there, but I don't think they have Wabash on the roof any longer.
Bring it back. We gotta bring it back.
Well, why not? Because at night, just go outside tonight, if it's not cloudy, and watch how many airplanes are flying to Chicago or to Detroit. Within an hour, you can count 5 or 10 airplanes. It's a steady stream going to Chicago. Not so many going to Detroit, but you can see.
Oh, I bet there's more than that, because where I'm at, I see probably every 10 minutes a plane.
Mm-hmm. Quite a few. You can see them. We could put a neon light up. Wabash.
Yeah, there we go.
We'll paint the roof of her house. Wabash on the top of the roof of her house.
There you go. Yes. Well, they needed that sign. Actually, some very famous people that we sometimes don't think about actually have flown through or over or stopped in Wabash. One of the most famous was probably Eddie Rickenbacker of World War I fame. And believe it or not, he had a Wabash connection. A couple of years ago, I met a fantastic woman from Wabash. Her name was Marilyn Lockwood. Her maiden name was Pettit. Marilyn Pettit Lockwood. Her father had been a United States congressman in Washington, D.C., and she had lived there with him, and she was a very close friend to Eddie Rickenbacker. He actually flew over Wabash, I think about 1927, at about 300 feet above the city. And he didn't just pass through. He flew around it 5 or 6 times and would wiggle his wings to the Pettit family. And Marilyn was there, and she had had an opportunity to fly with him. And she told him, I don't fly with nobody but my daddy. So she never went up with him. But he remembered the family, and he would dip his wings and circle around Wabash. Amazing the kind of stories that people can tell you if you just stop to listen to them. Marilyn passed away maybe 15 years ago, but she had those beautiful memories, and I don't believe anybody ever recorded them, so they're lost to time, and we'll never know them. But we had that connection. And Rickenbacker knew Pettit because Pettit was interested in flying and had passed or sponsored legislation involving flying. So they had socialized with each other. And to be that close to history is just fantastic and amazing. I'm sure there's more stories like that. I wish I knew them, but I unfortunately don't. After World War I, interest developed in flying, and we saw the development of an airport. The same thing happened with World War II. A lot of fellas during the war served in the Army Air Corps. They came back home, and they wanted to continue flying. I'm going to give you a side note here as some kind of food of thought. One of their other passions was motorcycle riding. They brought that back with them. And we have a motorcycle track that's famous in the state, just out on Dora Road, that they helped to create in the 1940s because they couldn't lose their interest in motorcycle riding that they'd learned while they were in the military. Same way with the airplane. But before I get to that, I'm jumping ahead of myself. I should tell you about World War II, because our most interesting experience, I think, or story, involves the small town of Lickskillet. Nobody's heard of Lickskillet.
No.
We have another name for it. It's called Red Bridge.
Oh.
And Red Bridge, in its heyday, never had more than maybe 70 people in it, and had no more than maybe 3 stores, a grocery store, a sawmill, and post office, and something else. It's located in Walls Township. And of course, Red Bridge was one of those towns that was destroyed. Its original name was Lickskillet. How it got that name, I have no idea, but I'm sure that there's a story there that someday we'll find out. But anyway, in 1942, after Pearl Harbor and the country on a war footing, the United States Navy, for whatever reason, decided to build a Navy base somewhere in Indiana. There were several places that wanted to have a Navy base, and one of them was Red Bridge. Another one was a little town called Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill, of course, is in Miami County. The Navy sent some men out. They looked at the land around Red Bridge. They looked at the land around Bunker Hill, and they decided the land around Red Bridge just wasn't suitable enough. It was too marshy. Now, we're talking about land that was to the south of Red Bridge, where the present Red Bridge is located, about that area. And although it was flat, it wasn't flat enough for them. There wasn't enough of it. So they decided to pick Bunker Hill, and of course built Bunker Hill Naval Air Base, which later became Grissom Air Force Base and is still in existence today. Later on, they decided that they needed an auxiliary field, and they were going to build an auxiliary field over near Somerset, just to the north of Somerset, across the reservoir in some flat area there. But the Navy decided against that. They were going to put in an auxiliary about 840 acres just to the north of Somerset. Instead, they put an auxiliary field on 24 just outside of Peru. Today, there's a lake there, and there's a resort camp located there. But at one time, that was the Auxiliary Air Force Air Base, and after the Navy Air Base closed the auxiliary, it turned into a skating rink and then eventually into a recreational vehicle place that it is today. Their air landing strips were round. In the Navy, you have to take advantage of the wind flow from a carrier. And in order to do that, they would have a round airfield where you could move the airplane around to face into the wind or in whatever direction you wanted. Those are gone. And of course, Grissom has the straight runways, and the Navy also had straight runways out there as well. But it's never ceased to amaze me. Why would you have a naval air base in the middle of Indiana? Mm-hmm. But we did, and it was successful, and it created a lot of jobs for Wabash people. And there are young men out, well, they're old men now, who when they were young men, as Boy Scouts, would go over there and go swimming. Oh, really? They would let the Boy Scouts go swimming out over there in their indoor swimming pool. Mm-hmm. Amazing history there. But anyway, those guys from World War II, they wanted an airport. They wanted someplace they could fly. And the old airport, well, we were growing that way. The town was growing out that way. So it was thought we should look for another location. And the location they found was south of Wabash on Airport Road. Mm-hmm. And they moved over to there. There were at least 2 hangars for private airplanes, and there were at least 5 businesses that had airplanes. And a man by the name of Colling, who was the president of Deal, was kind of the head honcho or shotgun in getting that going.
What year was that, Mr. Woodward?
About 1954 4 or 5, the movement started. By 58, the airport's out there. It's changed over the years. The airport has expanded its runways, has lights, has a tower, a beautiful headquarters facility, and quite a few hangars. If you go out there today, you can still see some of the original 1950s hangars. There was an airplane club, and they had headquarters out there, and you can still see their headquarters today if you go out there. During the 1980s, the airport would have fly-ins that were open to the public. They would encourage pilots from all over to fly their planes in. Vintage airplanes would fly in. Local pilots would take you on flights, either in helicopters or in airplanes, and fly you around Wabash for $5 an hour or so. I took advantage of many of those flights. I enjoyed it. It's nice if you get a chance. They sometimes do it, even in these days, to do it. It's fun. My problem is I fall asleep when I get in an airplane. I can't. I have a problem that way. But anyway, those were the major airports: Lincolnville, Serbia, and the 3 in Wabash. And I want to mention one other. There was a heliport. I'm going to classify that in with airports because of its uniqueness. At Rich Valley, out on Elliott Road, south of Rich Valley, was a heliport. The Roto-Whirl Company was headquartered there. And in the 1980s, they had a helicopter that provided helicopter service, crop dusting, and other kinds of services as well that operated out of there until a crash occurred. And I believe it took the pilot's life down at Pendleton, somewhere around Pendleton. And it's not there anymore, but that's part of our history that we need to recall. I think it in flight. Now, there are a couple of other things I'd like to mention because you see, Wabash's love of flying is not dead. It's not in limbo. It still survives. In your youth, you might remember when we had a space capsule go up and explode. 3 men in Wabash County applied for the seat in the Challenger. Out of 10,000 people around the United States, 3 were in Wabash and volunteered for that. They weren't selected, but they volunteered, which shows how much alive wanting to fly is still in the county, even at that date. And if you were to ask the 3, were they glad they weren't aboard, they would have told you no. Because they would love to have had that experience. It was a sad experience, and we haven't had it again since. And that explosion was traumatic for a lot of people, including the space program. But whenever you have adventure into a new frontier, there's always going to be risk involved. And at least 3 people stood up, submitted applications, and were considered out of that 10,000. Amazing.
Do we know who those 3 people were?
I know who 2 of them are. I'm not sure. I don't call the 3rd one. Bob Bone, who was a teacher at Wabash Middle School and was in the United States Air Force. And then this real goofy, unusual guy by the name of Ron Woodward.
It was you?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you asked that because he wasn't going to tell us.
He was not.
I
Totally
wasn't.
was
You know,
not.
you drug it out of me.
Yeah.
But the only recognition we got, and we weren't seeking recognition, that wasn't the whole purpose, was that we received a poster from Krista and a patch that we could wear and a couple of other mementos as all. But whenever I took kids to Washington, D.C., and we would go to the Arlington Cemetery, I'd always take them to the Challenger Monument that some of the pieces of their remains were buried there and a monument erected to them. We'd go and see that as well. Yeah. But yeah, it's still alive in Wabash County. And sometimes we lose sight that innovation costs, but there are people who are willing to take that risk and that cost. Yeah. Now, my interest was in the Navy. I flew in the Navy, and that's what this jacket is. I tried to zip it up, but I cannot do it anymore. I seem to have gained a little bit of weight over the years.
Hey, you can still get it on, so.
Yes. This was worn. I wore this when I flew in helicopters, and that's what this is. This is what I flew in.
Oh, my goodness.
Pardon me. Oh, wow. I can't get it going.
Yeah, you got it going.
There you go. There we go. This is an SH-3G Sea Lion, and I was attached to Helicopter Combat Support Squadron, HC-2, in Lakehurst, New Jersey. Occasionally, I would be part of the crew. The pilot sat up here, and I'd sit back here for as long as I could stay awake. And in 1969, when I joined the Navy, I thought I was going to ships, but what I ended up was going to aircraft. And for 2 years, I worked with HC-2. My office was located in the hangar at Lakehurst, New Jersey, where the Hindenburg blew up. Right next to the Hindenburg, where the Hindenburg came down and tied up at the hangar. They've since constructed 2 hangars, and I was in one of them, and my office sat right where the Hindenburg came down during the explosion. I was not there to see it. That was much before my time. And that was a dirigible, and that's when we lost interest in flying in dirigibles. However, Lakehurst, New Jersey still has hot air balloons or helium-filled balloons or hydrogen-filled balloons still there. And during World War II and into the Cold War, hot air balloons would fly out over the ocean on a continuous basis to watch for Russian activity. Then they were replaced by the helicopter I showed you. And took many hours in those helicopters, and I enjoyed it. I think I would have enlisted in the Army Reserve here if they would have had the helicopters have a base here, but they didn't. And I probably wouldn't have anyway, getting too old. But I know what it's like to fly, and that was my interest. And I know that there's a lot of men today who are interested in flying. And the next time you're on your way to Peru over Old US 24, I don't know the name of the road, but there is a sign that goes off to the right on Old 24. There is a Huey Museum to those veterans of the Vietnam War who the Huey meant so much to. And if you're ever at Akron, there's the Bell Museum of helicopters that you can visit in the small town of Akron to the north of us, about 30 minutes away.
Mr. Woodward, when you were flying in helicopters, were you ever a pilot?
I was not a pilot, no.
But you were on the crew that was on a helicopter.
Right.
So flying was a part of your military career then.
Right. I flew to, from Lakehurst, New Jersey. I went up to Providence, Rhode Island to meet and escort a Navy ship, and then served as escort to Puerto Rico and back, which was an interesting flight. had a young man who wanted to go on a flight who was on the ship. And he came to me one day and he said, "Is there any way I can get a flight on one of those helicopters?" And I said, I gave him this. I said, "You wear this and you can get on board and they'll take you out. We have to make a mail run to a submarine. And when it comes to the surface, they need someone to spot when it comes up and help them send it down. But what can you do for us in return?" Now, we were off the coast of Cuba at the time. I said, "We need a pizza.
Oh my goodness.
We need a pizza run."
I thought you were going to say cigars. You needed Cuban cigars, a pizza run.
No, pizza run. We're off the coast of Cuba. Lights out. Security doubled. Anyway, we made a deal. He would give us a pizza, a sheet pizza with everything on it for the entire air crew, which was about 25 people. We had 2 sheet pizzas. I took those in. They went like that. The next day we took him on his flight and he was happy ever after. That's when I would wear this when I would go out there in flying. They're a material that it doesn't burn very much. So if we were to crash and burn up, well, that was the best thing to do, is to wear something non-flammable.
Yeah.
But on the way to meet that ship, on the way, the airport, the pilot, now they weren't supposed to do this, but the pilot took this machine and went underneath the Verrazano Bridge.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, yes. Oh, he could have been court-martialed for that. Guess what? I was asleep.
Oh my gosh.
I missed that. We flew under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge and then went on up. And every one of those planes, three of them went underneath.
Oh my gosh.
We had 3 planes and helicopters and then landed. That night, we had 2 officers get drunk. I shouldn't be telling these stories. We had 2 officers get drunk.
Yes, you should. These are the stories, real stories, in addition to the history.
When they got back aboard ship, they walked off the flight deck and fell into the sea. So the next day, I had to take a crew out there and set up nets so that nobody else would fall off the back of the ship.
Oh my gosh.
Which was pretty good because when we got out in the middle of the Atlantic, the Russians started following us in a Russian trawler.
Yeah.
And every morning, before breakfast, I'd be out there watching them exercise. Their crew was all female crew.
Oh my gosh.
Of course you were. Of
And
course
they
that's
had
where
these-
he was.
They had shorts.
Yeah.
And they weren't like those shorts that they wore in gym class. So I and a bunch of other guys would be out there watching them exercise, and they'd wave, and we had fun. But our whole mission was to fly a piece of equipment down to Puerto Rico and test it. And the reason it had to be flown to Puerto Rico was they had the right temperature water. The temperature was just right. And they had to fly this equipment from California to Rhode Island, then put it on the ship. And then they had to have 7 ships and 2 submarines escort it. It was a trash can. It was a trash can. I don't know how many millions they spent on this, but we took that trash can down to Puerto Rico, threw it in the water, and they flipped a switch, and all of a sudden, this trash can made the sounds of an aircraft carrier if you were in a submarine. So the Russian trawler that was following us, all of a sudden on their scope, an aircraft carrier appears.
Yeah.
Guess what? It didn't work.
The trash can didn't work?
Trash can didn't work.
Shocking.
They had to take them back home, fly them back, try again. Didn't work. When we were in Puerto Rico, I asked one of the engineers, he said, "Ron, we just wanted a vacation in Puerto Rico." We had 3 days in Puerto Rico, you see, so everybody had fun.
Yeah.
And what do you get when you're in Puerto Rico?
Rum.
Yes, ma'am. So what did the air crew do? We had these big parts replacements
Yeah.
in manuals.
Yeah.
We had at least 6 of them, big things. Unloaded them, had oil in them, stuff we never used. We had to have it just in case.
Yeah.
Threw it into the sea. The empty trunks
Yeah.
were filled with rum
Yeah. Of course.
and brought back duty free.
Yeah.
That's the way it works.
Oh, I think we have to go back. I think we have something else broken.
Right.
This tie that you have to aviation, you can see that it's much more. I mean, there's always has been an infatuation with flight, but this runs deep for you. This tie to flying and from your service, you can tell.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure where you're going.
Just your appreciation for flight. It's personal. You know, for others, it might just be the fascination of flying because it's something that you were only ever a passenger at. You were such an active participant through your service that it's personal for you. And in addition to just your love for history, this is a personal.
And that's what these guys had in World War I and World War II. These fellows who served in the service and in flying, they brought that passion back with them, and they wanted to recreate it here and enjoy it here. And their passion has brought us to the point where we're at today. And even today, there are people from Wabash County in the service who are experiencing this flight of all sorts. What are they going to bring back to us in the future? And where are they going to head us and in what direction? And that poses a conundrum for Wabash. We've always been an open community that accepted change and worked with change and tried to bring it forward, but not always. A very good example, not dealing with aviation, but dealing with this theory of encouragement. Back in the early 1990s, a man came to Wabash and talked with Wabash officials and said, I'd like to start a company that makes keyless locks and the mechanisms to open those locks. Would you encourage me? City fathers said, what do you need? Well, you've got an empty building sitting down on East Market Street, the old Sears building. If you would give us that for 1 year, we would establish a company that make these keyless locks. And if we make a go of it, we'll buy the building and keep our business here. He described what he meant. He pulled out kind of a little fob, and you pushed little buttons and it would open locks. He was laughed at and not encouraged. Today, about every one of us, the only way we get in our car is to pull out this little fob and push a few buttons and it opens.
Yeah, we don't even use keys to start our cars anymore.
No.
Right.
Yeah, we start our cars from these fobs now.
Right.
So back to airports, Mr. Woodward, we're getting close to that hour mark. What would you say in regard to the overall impact that airports have had in Wabash County as a whole and its direction, and maybe even what the future could be for aviation and airports?
I really don't know, because there's a lot of innovations going on out there. Someday we may end up having cars that kind of zip through the air rather than on a road, and we'll need some kind of airport facility to manage them. I think they've had more of an impact than most people would imagine. We kind of take them for granted. We have an airport, okay, and only the rich can afford them. Well, It does take money to have an airplane. And not only the rich have had airplanes, some people today build their own airplanes and fly them around. One-seaters that are up in the air going all over the place these days is common. That may be the future. I don't know. But I know that the airports that we've had have inspired people to dream dreams, to look beyond themselves and to look at what could be done and what might be done. It's encouraged people into businesses that we would have never imagined before. It's expanded businesses that we've had in the past to where they could expand their services to other communities around the state and out of state as well. It's just been an encourager, and we've stayed on top of it. Our airport today may not handle every airplane that's out there, but it can handle some pretty good sized ones, and it can help people to get in their corporate life, to get to various places, to share information and knowledge with the people they work with, and to have allied companies out there that they can visit and go to. There are people today, every once in a while you see a helicopter flying over Wabash, circling it, surveying what's here, looking at empty plants that are available for us. So the impact is there. And fortunately, our airport commission and our city fathers see the advantage of keeping it upgraded and maintaining it so that it can be used. And most of us can't imagine really how much use it gets. There's very little publicity about it. We don't see anything unless something goes horribly wrong. But they have very few accidents at the airport itself, very few. I can only recall one at the airport itself where the pilot was beginning to take off and he passed out. That was about the most serious thing that happened at the airport here, although we have had the whole family nearly wiped out coming in for landing, but they didn't even hit the airport landing strip. It was outside their purview for whatever reason. Those things happen, but there's an interest and people do it. And believe it or not, there are people who will go to the airport tonight and fly to Fort Wayne or Indianapolis or Chicago for supper or a show and come back home. They choose to live here because of the environment that we have, the peace and tranquility that's here, but they want to take part in the life outside, and an airplane allows them to do that.
Well, Mr. Woodward, that's been 1 hour.
Hi, I'm Ron Woodward, and these are the Woodward Chronicles. Thanks for listening.
The Woodward Chronicles podcast is made possible by the generous support of the Lisa Gilman Investment Fund, the Sandra Kunkel Trust, Mark and Amy Ford, Paperworks Industries, the Community Foundation of Wabash County, and Visit Wabash County, and is created by Destination Wabash County.